It was the summer of 216 BC, and Rome stood uneasy beneath a sky that seemed intent on warning of catastrophe. Stones fell from the heavens upon the Aventine Hill, rattling through the streets as if the very gods hurled their anger at the city. In the Sabine country, sacred images bled as though divine eyes wept for what was to come. At Caire, the ground itself oozed crimson, and the waters of hot springs turned a sinister red, staining the earth with omens that no augur could dismiss. Then came lightning, tearing through the skies and striking the Campus Martius, killing men where they stood in the training grounds of war. To the Romans, these were not coincidences of nature, but signs from the divine, forewarnings that something terrible was on the horizon. Whispers spread that the gods had abandoned the she-wolf, that Rome's destiny trembled on the edge of ruin. Imagine walking through the city as neighbors muttered about portents too dreadful to ignore, mothers clutching their children more tightly, soldiers wondering if even Mars himself had turned against them. The sense of dread was not vague but immediate, because beyond these dark omens lurked a threat all too real. Hannibal Barca, Carthage's most daring general, had carved a bloody trail through Roman legions at Ticinus, Trebia, and Trasimene. Each defeat had been sharper than the last, each humiliation heavier, until the Senate feared the very survival of the Republic. Yet the omens seemed to suggest that what lay ahead would be far worse than anything Rome had yet endured. Still, the Romans pressed forward, refusing to surrender to superstition alone. If the gods demanded sacrifice, then Rome would answer with the blood of its enemies. And yet, as thunder rolled across the sky and shadows lengthened on the streets of the Eternal City, an unspoken question hung in the air. Were these warnings of divine wrath, or a cruel reminder that no matter how dire their losses had been, the true test of Rome's endurance had not yet begun? By the time Hannibal descended into Italy, Rome's confidence had been battered as if by repeated hammer blows. The Republic had long believed in the discipline of its legions and the inexhaustible manpower of its citizenry. Yet, at the Trebia River, Hannibal's cavalry had trampled their pride. At Lake Trasimene, entire cohorts were swallowed in a fog-bound ambush, thousands cut down before they even had a chance to form ranks. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Rome was being outthought and outmaneuvered by a single man who seemed to predict every move before it was made. Hannibal's genius was not measured only in tactics, but in his understanding of human nature. He had grasped the flaws of Roman command, the impatience of young leaders, their hunger for decisive glory, and their inability to resist an open challenge. At every step, he offered them exactly what they craved, and they rushed into his snares with predictable eagerness. To the Senate, it seemed less like a war of armies and more like a war of minds. And Hannibal's was sharper, more daring, and utterly relentless. Rome's response was both defiant and desperate. They resolved that sheer weight of numbers would succeed where strategy had failed. For the year 216 BC, the Senate ordered the mustering of an unprecedented force. 8 legions of Roman citizens, each matched by allied contingents drawn from across Italy. In total, nearly 89,000 soldiers answered the call, a host so immense it dwarfed anything Hannibal could field. At its head marched both consuls of the year, Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, bound to alternate command each day. One embodied patience, caution, and discipline, the other burned with ambition, eager to erase Rome's shame in a single crushing blow. This pairing was both Rome's strength and its weakness. Paulus counseled restraint, reminding his men that victories were preserved by discipline, not rashness. Varro, however, embodied the restless fury of the Republic, a man determined to seize destiny rather than wait for it. Between them stretched an army larger than any Rome had ever assembled, yet behind their banners lay a silent truth. Numbers alone had never guaranteed victory against Hannibal. Rome had placed its faith in brute force, convinced that the Republic could not be defeated on its own soil when marshaled in such strength. But while Rome celebrated its unprecedented muster, Hannibal was already studying how to turn their pride into their undoing. Though the Romans feared Hannibal's presence in Italy, they also understood that no army could endure without lifelines. The Senate and its magistrates studied the Carthaginian general with sober calculation, identifying 4 pillars that upheld his ability to wage war. If any could be broken, the Republic's chances of survival would grow. The first was the loyalty of Rome's Italic allies. Hannibal's victories had been spectacular, but their true danger lay in their potential to shake the faith of Rome's partners in the peninsula. If southern cities defected, the Republic would not only bleed soldiers but also risk seeing its authority fracture from within. The second pillar lay far away, in Iberia. Hannibal's family commanded rich silver mines and hardy troops there, resources that replenished his coffers and armies. As long as Carthage held Spain, Hannibal's strength could be renewed indefinitely. The third was Carthage itself, the mother city across the sea, whose political will and material aid remained essential. The fourth was Hannibal's Gallic allies in Cisalpine Gaul, tribes who had long resented Rome and now marched eagerly at his side. Rome did not intend to meet Hannibal on a single front alone, even as Paulus and Varro gathered their massive force in Italy. The Scipio brothers harassed Hasdrubal in Spain, cutting into the lifeline of silver and reinforcements. A great fleet under Gnaeus Servilius Geminus struck across the Mediterranean, raiding North Africa to remind Carthage that the war could be brought to their own shores. To the north, Praetor Lucius Postumius advanced with fresh legions against the Boii in Gaul, hoping to shatter Hannibal's tribal support. In this grand design, Paulus and Varro's army was but one part of a larger mosaic. Their mission was to break the first pillar, to confront Hannibal directly and crush his appeal to Italy's allies. Rome believed that if each campaign struck true, the invaders' foundation would crumble. Yet, as events would soon show, Hannibal had no intention of letting the Romans dictate the pace of war. As Rome's vast host marched southward into Apulia, the clash of its two commanders' personalities became ever more apparent. Paulus, the seasoned aristocrat, urged caution at every step, his instincts sharpened by years of war. Varro, the ambitious homo novus, brimmed with impatience, eager to lead the Republic to a decisive triumph and inscribe his name in history. The alternating rhythm of their shared command mirrored Rome itself, torn between prudence and pride, restraint and rage. The army itself was colossal by ancient standards, a human tide that stretched for miles along the dusty roads of Italy. 8 legions of citizens, an equal number of allied troops, tens of thousands of camp followers, and herds of supply animals made the march less a campaign and more a moving city. Yet Hannibal, ever the strategist, had already chosen the ground where he would meet this juggernaut. Near the village of Cannae, a plain stretched wide and flat, hemmed in by the Aufidus River on one side and gentle hills on the other. For cavalry, it was a battlefield designed by fortune itself, and Hannibal held the advantage of horse. Before the armies drew close, a brief clash foreshadowed the dangers to come. Varro, commanding on his day, pushed forward a detachment that met Hannibal's skirmishers and cavalry. At first, the Romans seemed to triumph, driving back their foes and suffering few losses. Jubilant, Varro mistook this minor success as a sign of greater victories ahead. Paulus, however, saw in it only peril. Hannibal's strength was not in rash engagements, but in traps hidden within the folds of the land. His caution deepened when scouts discovered Hannibal's camp seemingly abandoned, fires still burning and supplies left behind as though ripe for plunder. The temptation was irresistible to many officers, and Varro clamored for a swift assault on the deserted camp. But fortune, for once, favored restraint. A trusted prefect returned with dire news. Hannibal's men lay hidden on the ridges, ready to slaughter any who rushed in. The ambush failed, yet the danger was clear. Hannibal was never idle, never careless. Rome's commanders had skirted disaster, but the lesson was quickly forgotten. For the plain of Cannae still awaited them, and Hannibal's masterpiece had only begun to take shape. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, the plains of Cannae fell silent beneath the weight of two armies. To the north stood the Romans, nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, a force so vast that the earth seemed to tremble beneath their ranks. To the south waited Hannibal, outnumbered 2-1, his 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry dwarfed by the enemy before him. Yet numbers had never frightened him. He had chosen this ground with care, a chessboard on which every piece already moved according to his will. The Romans arranged themselves in the familiar pattern of brute force, infantry massed into a deep, solid block. Its sheer density meant to crush whatever lay in its path. Cavalry was placed on either wing, Paulus commanding near the river, Varro stationed on the left with Italian allies. It was an army shaped like a hammer, and its leaders believed it could strike with irresistible weight. Hannibal's formation was different and deceptive. At the center, his Iberian and Gallic infantry stood in a crescent bulging outward, seemingly frail against the Roman wall of steel. Behind them, slightly hidden, he positioned his veteran Libyan infantry, armored with captured Roman gear and disciplined to hold their ground until the moment of decision. On the wings he placed his cavalry, Hasdrubal's heavy horse near the river to meet Paulus, and Maharabal's nimble Numidians on the opposite flank to face Varro. A screen of slingers and javelin throwers danced in front, the first sting of a trap that Rome had yet to recognize. The clash began with missiles and skirmishes, but the true contest opened when the cavalry thundered forward. Hasdrubal's Iberians and Gauls slammed into the Roman horse on the right, a savage melee fought in the dust by men who quickly abandoned saddles to grapple and kill on foot. Slowly, the Roman cavalry gave way, pressed against the riverbank until panic broke their cohesion. Paulus was wounded and nearly cut down, his men scattering northward in disarray. On the opposite flank, Maharabal's Numidians circled Varro's Italians, loosing javelins and feigning retreat, only to return again with cunning speed. Some even pretended to defect, allowed into Roman lines before turning their hidden blades on those who had trusted them. Shock and betrayal shattered Varro's command, sending his allies fleeing to their camp. Yet it was in the center that Hannibal's design revealed itself most clearly. The massive Roman infantry surged forward, driving the crescent inward. Step by step, the Carthaginian line bent, its shape shifting from convex to concave. To Roman eyes, this was victory unfolding, the enemy collapsing before their strength. They pressed harder, a wedge of humanity forcing the Gauls and Iberians backward. But the retreat was no rout. It was measured, deliberate, a tightening coil, then the jaws snapped shut. From either flank, Hannibal's Libyan infantry wheeled inward, their armor gleaming in the sun, their spears striking into exposed Roman flanks. What had been a single contest became a slaughter on three sides. Confusion rippled through the legions as they realized they were fighting enemies not only ahead but also beside them, and the trap was not yet complete. With both Roman wings broken, Hannibal unleashed his cavalry. Hasdrubal and Maharabal regrouped, wheeling their horses behind the Roman mass and charging into their rear. Now the legions were ringed entirely, a living wall of Carthaginian steel enclosing tens of thousands in a shrinking circle. The press of bodies became suffocating. Men could scarcely lift their arms to fight, let alone escape. dust choked the air, the cries of the wounded rose, and the sun bore down mercilessly as the Romans found themselves caught in the perfect storm of annihilation. What began as a clash of armies descended into one of the greatest massacres in recorded history. Encircled on all sides, the Roman legions were pressed into a tightening pocket, their ranks compressed until men could scarcely breathe, let alone raise their shields. Spears pierced from every direction, swords cut through the packed lines, and the sheer weight of bodies crushed the fallen beneath the feet of their comrades. What Rome had believed would be a hammer blow of strength had become a trap that sealed its own destruction. Consul Aemilius Paulus, already wounded, fought stubbornly among his soldiers, refusing to abandon them even as the tide of blood rose around him. A tribune offered him a horse to escape, but Paulus rejected the plea. Better, he declared, to die with his men than to carry home the shame of survival. Others were not so steadfast. Varro fled with a handful of horsemen, escaping to Venusia, while the proconsuls and tribunes who had once commanded legions fell one by one. Nearly the entire Roman high command was extinguished in a single day. The slaughter was methodical, relentless, and all but complete. Of Rome's 80,000 infantry, scarcely 3,000 escaped. Of 6,000 cavalry, fewer than 400 survived. Polybius and Livy alike recorded the devastation with astonishment. As many as 70,000 Romans and allies lay dead, their corpses piled in ghastly heaps across the plain of Cannae. Nearly every household in Italy would grieve a son, a father, or a brother. Hannibal, by contrast, lost fewer than 6,000 men. Yet even in the face of such ruin, the Roman spirit flickered defiantly. Survivors in the camps attempted desperate breakouts. Some succeeded in reaching Canusium, others were captured, but nowhere did the Republic bend to surrender. In the aftermath, Livy describes scenes so gruesome they surpassed the battlefield itself. Men mutilated beyond recognition, others burying their heads in pits to suffocate rather than meet Carthaginian blades. And one Roman, hands useless, tearing at an enemy with his teeth. Even in despair, Rome's resistance spoke of a will that no disaster could fully extinguish. For Hannibal, Cannae was the zenith of his genius, the perfect battle studied by generals for millennia. For Rome, it was the darkest of days. And yet, in that darkness lay the seeds of resilience. The Republic would not sue for peace, nor would it collapse into ruin. Instead, it would endure, rebuild, and rise again, proving that even from the ashes of Cannae, Rome's destiny was not yet finished.